Chapter 6. Warfare. The role of robotics in modern warfare is changing rapidly, and with the most strategic of implications. How war is waged, where combat is occurring, and the risks that apply to combatants on both sides are all being redefined. Moral issues of warfare, never simple to navigate, are also becoming more complicated. Motivation. As its broad mandate, DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense's R&D organization, strives to make pivotal investments in breakthrough technologies for national security. The vision for DARPA's Tactical Technology Office, where robotics research is primarily centered, is to rapidly develop new prototype military capabilities that create an asymmetric technological advantage and provide U.S. forces with decisive superiority and the ability to overwhelm our opponents. Ronald Arkin, a Georgia Tech robotics researcher, asserts that the TTO's vision fuels 4 interrelated objectives. Force multiplication, where fewer soldiers are needed for a given mission, and where an individual soldier can now do the job of what took many before. Expand the battle space, where combat can be conducted over larger areas than was previously possible. Extending the warfighter's reach, to allow an individual soldier to act deeper into the battle space, for example, seeing farther or striking farther. Casualty reduction, removing soldiers from the most dangerous and life-threatening missions. Several of the concepts involved in achieving these objectives deserve deeper consideration. First, asymmetric warfare characterizes the U.S. wars of the 21st century. 2 contrastingly equipped and motivated sides fight, with each side seeking to take advantage of its superior assets. The United States deploys massive technological superiority, whereas the insurgents capitalize on their greater ideological appeal in a native population. That the insurgents' ideology might sanction suicide bombers, for example, or human shields in the form of school children or hospitals, renders some of the United States' technological advantage moot. At the same time, a dearth of Arabic speakers in particular, and of cultural sensitivity and understanding more generally within U.S. forces, makes capturing the hearts and minds of affected populations highly problematic. As opposed to air war with Germany or naval war with Japan in World War II, when the 2 sides were much more closely matched in both doctrine and arms, present-day asymmetric warfare drives a search for not merely better equipment, such as the jet engine in World War II, but entirely new modes of combat. Hence the concept of expanding the battle space. The theoretical construct known as a 3-block war was introduced in the 1990s to describe the potential for an Army or Marine Corps to be fighting armed conflict in one area, performing peacekeeping nearby, and delivering humanitarian aid in a 3rd block of a hypothetical town. Although it cannot serve as a literal strategy and does not include the essential tasks of nation-building that were undertaken in Iraq, the complexity of modern war makes application of classical military doctrines problematic. When the field of battle is no longer defined by sides that capture territory, the role of armed forces, especially on the ground, can change dramatically. As far as force manipulation goes, the composition of a modern army or navy is considerably different from what it was 2 generations ago. Public opposition to bloodshed has changed the politics of military budgeting and deployment. The military's tasks, establishing the rule of law versus clearing mines, approaches, frontal warfare versus counterinsurgency, motivations, protecting shipping lanes versus a war on terror, and combat personnel, draftees versus volunteers, including women and people of multiple sexual orientations, are all different in 2016 from what they were in 1976. Thus, a wide variety of factors helps motivate the development of robotic technologies for warfare, and the considerable impact of billions of defense-related dollars on the state of robotic art and science means that many non-defense developments likely owe their existence to one of these battlefield imperatives. For these, and other reasons, a closer look at military robots is essential for an adequate understanding of robotics more generally. Types and forms of military robots. The range of applications of robotics to military use is broad and increasing every year. The following is intended not as a catalog of the robotic arsenal, but rather as an introduction to basic types and forms of military robots. Air. To date, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, have been primarily used for reconnaissance purposes, although Predators and the much more heavily armed Reapers have also been used to deliver ordnance. UAVs range in size from a few pounds to substantial. Compare a hand-launched Raven at 3 feet in length to the Global Hawk at 44 feet, about the size of a corporate jet, and 26,750 pounds, about 13.5 tons. A constant dilemma lies in choices of instrumentation. Keeping a UAV light and, to an extent, dispensable is achieved by minimizing the sensor load. On the other hand, single-purpose aircraft are more difficult to maintain at a suitable level of readiness, especially when procured years before their current deployment, which might entail the need for new sensors. Thus, many UAVs have suffered from requirements creep and become heavier than planned at the expense of performance, time aloft, and budget projections. As of a 2012 report by the Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. military owned 10,767 manned and roughly 7,500 unmanned aircraft. The vast majority, 5,300 of those UAVs, are U.S. Army Ravens, 4-pound reconnaissance aircraft launched by throwing them, much as you would toy gliders. The same report notes that, whereas projected total spending from 2001 to 2013 for unmanned aerial systems, UAS, which include ground control stations and data links needed to operate UAVs, is more than $26 billion, manned aircraft still got 92% of Pentagon funds for aircraft procurement. In 2009, the budget for one F-22 manned fighter could have bought 85 Predator drones, for which training and operating costs would have been significantly lower as well. The capabilities of drones compared to manned aircraft and satellites can be summarized as follows. 1. Drones can linger over geographies of current interest for 24 to 48 hours at a time, at altitudes above the limits of enemy fire and at no risk to human pilots, and deliver high-resolution, real-time imagery, whereas satellites can only fly over these areas for brief times, do not deliver imaging and other intelligence in sufficiently high resolution or in real time, and must be tasked long in advance. The drone's ability to stay aloft for long periods has numerous benefits. Large physical areas can be surveyed, smaller ones studied in greater detail, and targets of interest tracked. One challenge going forward, as with other forms of video surveillance, is to automate the processing of tens of thousands of hours of imagery. 2. Unlike manned fighter aircraft, drones can be launched from and returned to airstrips located far from their targets. As P.W. Singer put it in his book, Wired for War, a Global Hawk can fly from San Francisco, spend a day hunting for any terrorists in the entire state of Maine, and then fly back to the West Coast. Pilots are kept out of enemy airspace, avoiding the strategic and diplomatic risks entailed therein. 3. Drones keep human pilots out of harm's way, deliver many of the same air-to-ground capabilities that manned aircraft do, and because they are mechanically simpler, spend a higher proportion of their time either in flight or ready to fly. The F-22 fighter jet, for example, was reported by the Washington Post in 2009 to require 30 hours of maintenance per flight hour, whereas the Predator drone was reported to require only 1 hour of maintenance per flight hour in a border patrol scenario. Combat readiness figures were not available. Indeed, drones provide a far better bang for the buck in both procurement and operational costs. In a time of shrinking defense budgets, manned fighter jets that can claim dogfight superiority are an expensive proposition, especially given how little air-to-air combat has occurred in the past 40 years. 4. Training drone pilots takes far less time at far less cost, given the extensive and expensive airtime required of flight school pilots. Drones can tirelessly perform mundane tasks, such as flying in a routine pattern to cover a large area, much like a farmer plowing a field, that human pilots would find boring and likely perform with less precision. Because inanimate objects can withstand greater G-forces than human pilots can, drones should eventually be able to outmaneuver manned craft. And drones can fly in dangerous conditions, radiation, volcanic activity, enemy fire, without risking the life or health of human pilots. Indeed, sacrificing a drone to get enemy anti-aircraft batteries to turn on their tracking systems so they can be located would seem to be an entirely justified strategic trade-off in certain circumstances. 5. Drones' lighter weight and smaller engines make them easier to ship into service, harder to detect, and cheaper. Smaller engines mean less noise, less pollution, less fuel usage, and cheaper, lower-spec components. Keeping a pilot out of the cockpit of an aircraft simplifies design, lowers weight, and maximizes use of all its available resources, including fuel, to deliver either surveillance or weapons. Sea. To date, seawater presents a more challenging environment than air or land for unmanned vehicles, so there is less news to report. Saltwater is highly corrosive. Wind, tides, and currents make navigation less amenable to automation. Fog and rain stress sensors for robots in all environments. Waves can present stressful physical environments for sensitive electronics, and secure radio access to offshore and especially underwater craft is limited. Nevertheless, unmanned vessels' potential for dull tasks such as monitoring or mapping the ocean floor, or dangerous work such as mine detection and detonation, is sufficiently promising that several initiatives are underway. To date, there are fewer production drone craft in the Navy than in the other armed forces, for a number of reasons, some technical, some historical, and others organizational. Unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs, also called autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, must operate independently, given the limits of radio signals, must have a power source suitable for low-noise unmanned operation, and must be protected from being captured and potentially repurposed by an enemy. Thus, armed craft are a longer-term objective, but surveillance and mine clearing fall within a near-term time horizon. The Remus is a converted torpedo made by a Norwegian firm, for example, and there are reports of unmanned mini-subs launched from conventional submarines. The Sea Glider, made by the same firm that builds the Remus, is powered not by an electric motor, but by small changes in buoyancy, allowing it to collect data while at sea for months at a time, offloading readings from the surface to satellites. As elsewhere, the line between scientific data collection and military applications can be blurry at times, but to date, many UUVs have been used to carry out research. A new UUV is in the midst of sea trials. Weighing 6,200 pounds, 3.1 tons, the Proteus is 25 feet long and can be operated in either autonomous or manned mode. Payloads vary, but seals, bomblets, and other cargo can be accommodated. The Proteus has a theoretical range of 900 miles on battery charge at a top speed of 10 knots, 11.5 miles per hour, and can descend roughly 100 feet. An unmanned surface vehicle, USV, the Spartan Scout, is a 36-foot boat capable of speeds of 50 miles per hour. It is equipped with a wide array of sensors, making it more suited to reconnaissance than to the minesweeping work done by the Remus, although it carries a .50 caliber machine gun aboard, along with speakers and microphones for remote interrogation of suspicious surface craft. The Spartan Scout was used in the Persian Gulf during the Iraq War in 2003. The Israeli Navy claims to have deployed the first USV, the Protector, a rigid inflatable craft 30 feet long, there is now a 36-foot version, for surveillance and reconnaissance. Land. Robotic ground systems have advanced rapidly in the past 15 years, with different species emerging. One way to differentiate among the unmanned ground vehicle, UGV variants, is to look at their mode of locomotion. UGVs that use wheels or treads constitute one class, those which use legs another. Wheeled. The world's largest robotic vehicle is a 700-ton dump truck not currently used in combat, but in mining. The far smaller Oshkosh Terramax is in fact sizable by most nominating standards and used by the military for supply and reconnaissance. Weight and other specifications are not available, but its drive-by-wire technology, already used for many systems, throttle, brake, etc., can be readily adapted to remote control or even autonomous operation. At the other extreme of UGV size, the Boston Dynamics Sandflea weighs 11 pounds and has a gas piston for launching itself 30 feet into the air and onto a roof. Gyro stabilizers keep the device oriented and level during flight so as to maintain usable video imagery. Although current versions provide eyes and ears, it's not hard to imagine a smart grenade on a similar platform. Tracked. Tracked UGVs have come to the forefront in the Middle East wars since 2001. Most are produced by two Boston firms spun out of MIT. One firm, iRobot, makes the PackBot, a 24-pound remote-controlled tracked vehicle that has been used to discover and disarm thousands of improvised explosive devices. Building on a reconnaissance device, later generations of PackBots and similar vehicles have added mechanical arms and grippers to move small objects and disarm or safely detonate explosive devices. Other models have added a variety of sensor, camera, and software configurations capable of localizing gunshots to help spot snipers, detecting hazardous materials, toxic gases, and radiation, and recognizing faces. As of 2013, 2,000 such devices were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. A second MIT spin-out company, substantially older than iRobot, Foster Miller, also makes tracked combat UGVs, now under the name Kinetic, the company that acquired it. The Talon is bigger, at about 125 pounds, depending on configuration, faster, and comes in more configurations than the PackBot. Most notably, the SWORDS, or SWORDS, Special Weapons Observation Reconnaissance Detection System version of the Talon, is loaded with a choice of weapons, although its deployment has been limited. Available armament options include a rifle, shotgun, machine gun, and grenade launcher. Although the SWORDS is believed to be the first armed UGV to see combat, more common scenarios see the tracked combat robots run into buildings thought to be booby-trapped, into caves, or around corners before human soldiers expose themselves to risk. At times, the robots have carried a grenade or similar cargo into an adversary's territory, sometimes saving lives by sacrificing themselves. More tracked variations are emerging. The iRobot First Look weighs only 5 pounds and is designed to be thrown through windows or otherwise deployed as a soldier's eyes and ears. The Recon Robotics Scout, which weighs just over 1 pound and whose heavy metal wheels can break glass, can safely be thrown more than 100 feet. The Scout automatically rights itself upon landing and, like the First Look, transmits video feeds over a wireless network. In February 2012, the U.S. Army ordered 1,100 of these Throwbots. Like other reconnaissance robots, the Scout is also being rapidly integrated into police, fire, SWAT, and other domestic public safety applications after having proved itself in combat. Legged. Though still an emerging class of ground robots, legged UGVs may well represent the future of combat robots. DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense's think tank, has been pushing their development, in part through its support of Boston Dynamics, yet another MIT spin-out firm. The firm's publicity videos are impressive. Its Cheetah robot has exceeded 29 miles per hour on a treadmill. Its LS-3 robot, essentially a pack mule, has demonstrated a striking capability to traverse uneven ground, although it is as loud as a lawnmower. In 2015, Boston Dynamics introduced a new version of a humanoid robot, Atlas II, designed to be used in a DARPA challenge to cope with a reactor disaster scenario like Fukushima. The competing robots had to climb through wreckage, be able to withstand heat, radiation, and other adverse conditions, and manipulate valves, levers, and similar controls characteristic of a nuclear reactor. In navigating an environment designed for humans, they also had to be able to open various kinds of door handles, use tools, and perform complex tasks. For some teams participating in the DARPA challenge, the Atlas robot and its predecessor served as a shared platform to build upon if they lacked resources to build their own hardware. Other robots that mimic biological structures are also in development. Crawling legged robots are designed to meet the new requirement for greater flexibility and mobility in combat scenarios. Thus, the Boston Dynamics RHEX, or REX, which moves on 6 unhinged legs that are essentially rigid arcs of tread material and weighs about 30 pounds, can traverse extremely challenging terrain. Indeed, the Rex can even negotiate ditches and culverts, where insurgents began hiding IEDs once they discovered tracked robots could not fit into those spaces. Autonomy. To date, the large drones that get most of the public's attention are remotely piloted by humans via video links. Smaller, autonomous drones like the Raven can fly to GPS waypoints and can land on their own, but they carry only sensors. The U.S. Navy has developed a next-generation semi-autonomous UAV, the X-47B, that has successfully landed on an aircraft carrier, one of the hardest tasks in aviation. Beyond takeoff and landing, however, a debate over autonomous targeting and firing of weapons has already begun. The Phalanx shipborne anti-missile system is essentially a robot that detects close-in oncoming missiles and fires a Gatling gun at 4,500 rounds per minute. Humans are only tangentially in the loop, given the imminent nature of the threat. Because of their distinctive shape, Phalanxes are known in the U.S. Navy as R2-D2s and in the British Navy as Daleks. There are deep concerns, however, about autonomous robots firing on people, whether from an airborne drone or a land-based platform. 3 basic relationships between human operators and lethal robotic delivery systems can be considered. With human-in-the-loop configurations, a human sees the information provided by the UAV or other device and, if the firing criteria are met, issues a direct order to fire whatever weapon is available. One step removed is the human-on-the-loop weapon, in which a human operator can override the robotic decision after the information has been processed and a target identified autonomously. In the future, human out-of-the-loop architectures would allow a robotic weapon to detect, select, and fire on a target without human intervention. The advantages of a fully autonomous weapon are many. In tense border or other scenarios, such weapons minimize the chances that the human operators will be killed or incapacitated in a sneak attack. At the North Korea-South Korea border, semi-autonomous lethal robots built by a division of Samsung are already deployed. Robots do not fall asleep or object to harsh conditions or go native. Georgia Tech roboticist Ronald Arkin is helping to develop autonomous robots for the U.S. Army, Navy, and other agencies. He argues that robots can potentially be better soldiers than humans for 6 reasons, which I summarize here. 1. Because robots do not need to kill or be killed, their algorithms can be more conservative than those taught human soldiers by boot camp and field experience. That is, a robotic warrior can be programmed to sacrifice itself in ways that are morally and operationally difficult for human soldiers to do so. 2. Eventually, the robotic sensor suite will be better, more robust, more extensive, more redundant, more integrated with sensor networks than the sense organs of a scared, often confused human. 3. Robots lack emotions, so retribution, fear, and hysteria can be removed from the targeting equation in ways they cannot with human soldiers. 4. Behavioral psychology powerfully illustrates the framing biases of humans. We see what we want to see, or fear seeing, even if it is not there. Robots lack these biases. 5. Sensor integration through greater processing power, better algorithms, and lower probability of information overload gives the robotic warrior an advantage over the human. 6. Robots can be impartial. If they act as observers and recorders of activity with a mixed human-robot team, the robotic elements can act as a check on human ethical infractions and other breaches of discipline. To his credit, Arkin is also frank about the potential for ethical failures of robotic warfare. Technical, political, operational, and human rights issues are only beginning to be explored. Concerned organizations such as Human Rights Watch and the United Nations have raised cogent objectives. Who will assess the danger posed by robotic warfare to civilian populations, with human judgment invariably clouded by bad or missing information, deception, or mistaken narrative framing? How will the limits of AI rules engines be recognized and respected? In many Arab countries, guns are sometimes fired toward the sky at celebrations, like weddings. It is not difficult to imagine an autonomous aircraft spotting gunfire from an AK-47 and retaliating, for example. Although this example is hypothetical, another is not. In 2008, a U.S. airstrike was reported to have killed 47 members of a wedding party escorting the bride to her groom's house in Afghanistan, including 39 women and children. An Afghan inquiry claimed none of the dead were connected to al-Qaeda or the Taliban. No U.S. inquiry findings were ever made public. Will a robot be able to recognize and act on signals of surrender? And will vanquished fighters surrender to machines, an act that in some cultures would reflect cowardice? Who will be responsible for a robotic kill gone wrong? The robot's manufacturer? The robot computer's programmer or programmers? The pilot or video analyst operating or overseeing the robot, who could be a contractor and not a combatant? The presiding officer? The commander-in-chief? What will happen if going to war becomes too easy, given the lower probability of human military casualties? What will happen if going to war or fighting a war involves microsecond decisions, much like those in Wall Street's high-frequency trading? If algorithms are fighting algorithms, first-mover advantage could be substantial. If warring nations can kill enemy warfighters with little or no danger to their own, will such wars be viewed as unjust? Will the technical problems of facial recognition, lethal and non-lethal weapons, such as rubber bullets or sonic weapons, potential radio interference, false positives and false negatives, ever be satisfactorily solved? What happens when the robot refuses a human order to override, or warfighters hesitate to second-guess a computer? In 1988, an early automated guided missile system called Aegis on the USS Vincennes, a cruiser stationed off the coast of Iran, targeted a civilian airliner and blew up 290 passengers, even with a human in the loop. Given limited information and international tensions in the area, it is not unreasonable to believe the operator could have been worried about failing to defend against an enemy attack had he not allowed the system to fire. What will happen if overrides are made or refused for political, psychosocial, or other unpredictable reasons? What will happen in a Dr. Strangelove scenario? How will the vanquished react to losing to a force of robots? What will happen when, not if, combat robots are co-opted? The video feed from the U.S. Predator drones was for a time only lightly encrypted and thus easily viewed by the enemy. Hidden software has already been discovered to be embedded in microprocessors, so there is every reason to believe robots could be hacked to the home country's disadvantage, either after capture or through sabotage. Consequences. The use of unmanned vehicles in warfare has had many unexpected consequences. The following examples only illustrate the breadth of issues raised so far. The future will grow more complicated still. After the Vietnam War became known as the Living Room War, shaped in large measure by film aired on the TV network's evening newscasts, and Gulf War I as the Nintendo War, based on the night vision footage of missiles and smart bombs vividly blasting Iraqi targets, more recent warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan have contributed drone-captured YouTube videos to the public's viewing menu. Unlike the unsettling footage of U.S. troops in Vietnam that helped turn public against Lyndon Johnson and later Richard Nixon, so-called war porn from Iraq and Afghanistan is pro-U.S. and often circulated by the U.S. military and can draw more than 1 million views per clip. Pilots of unmanned vehicles are physically safe, sitting in a cubicle thousands of miles from either the drone's target or sources of enemy fire. The emotional toll, however, is only beginning to be understood. Fighting a remote war for 12 hours, then returning to a suburban life, with a family and the expectations thereof, is more than jarring. The lack of band of brothers unit cohesion among drone pilots is another factor. Sharing hardship would build a camaraderie that could help the pilots process the intense emotions of their job. Witnessing a U.S. unit being ambushed and being powerless to help is reported to be a particularly wrenching experience. The tactical and strategic advantages provided by UAVs can also convey unintended cultural meanings. U.S. enemies may well view sending unmanned vehicles to do the killing, with no risk to U.S. pilots, not simply as technological cleverness, but also as cowardice. In the words of Indian Muslim author Mubashir Jawad Akbar, "In war terms, if you are not willing to sacrifice blood, you are essentially a coward." Thus, the technology that keeps U.S. warfighters out of harm's way may also be motivating its enemies to greater resistance and legitimizing new anti-U.S. beliefs and behaviors. For anyone who has been upset by an interrupted or lost cell phone connection, understanding the radio frequency, RF landscape in a military engagement is both a sobering and daunting challenge. Given how much radio energy is being produced and consumed in the form of encrypted communications, GPS, video feeds, reconnaissance by multiple technologies, radar, and attempted or actual jamming of all of the above, it is not surprising that there can be serious disruptions. What works well or passably well in controlled trials can be difficult or even impossible in the data smog of battle, especially given the lack of shared infrastructure and the need for encryption, which multiplies the size of even simple messages and amplifies demands on the infrastructure. One underappreciated aspect of the future of robotic warfare will be the innovations and counter-innovations with regard to wireless control, oversight, and jamming of autonomous devices. Conclusion. Throughout human history, war and conflict have given rise to major technological advancements. Gunpowder, steamships, aircraft, nuclear power, GPS, and the Internet are just a few of such innovations. Like other military devices before them, unmanned vehicles have great potential for both good and bad. Drone aircraft could transform humanitarian relief, for example. Legged ground robots could become superhuman firefighters or disaster rescuers. Just as likely, however, killer robots could do the bidding of drug lords, religious extremists, or alienated youths. Figuring out how to frame the social discussions that are emerging from robotics labs and the mass production of robots is a high-priority task for politicians, legislators, judges and juries, and citizens the world over. Chapter 7. Robots and Economics. Given that robots have been performing assembly line tasks for nearly 50 years, it is somewhat surprising how little is known about the relationship of robots to productivity and employment. As robotics expands from assembly line to supply chain and eventually to service applications, the use of robots will affect more people and thus presumably move the issue closer to mainstream discussion. Do robots take human workers' jobs? There's a thought experiment in which you're asked to take the position of an engineer in 1890 and project the amount of horse manure in New York City in 1920. Linear extrapolation produces a frightening result, which of course never happened. The invention of the automobile shifted the externalities of transportation, and, instead of staggering quantities of horse manure in 1920, we got suburbs, McDonald's, high-speed roadways, and dozens of other side effects, starting in 1930 and continuing on through the present. Something of the same situation applies today with regard to the impact of information, and soon, robotic technologies on unemployment. It's easy to assume that ATMs put bank tellers out of work, for example. President Obama implied as much in a speech in 2011. The evidence, however, suggests otherwise. The number of bank tellers increased from about 450,000 to 527,000 in the first 20 years of ATM technology. Whether there might have been an even larger job increase without ATM technology is, of course, impossible to know. The same goes for robots and automobile jobs. Unemployment in Detroit has a variety of causes, and it's impossible to isolate robots as a decisive factor, given the rise of Japanese and later Korean automakers, ongoing subsidies to national champion automakers in some countries that prevent a market shakeout, declining rates of automobile ownership, the state of labor unions outside the industrial Midwest, and the contribution of pensions and health care costs to Big Three labor economics. Note that both self-serve gas pumps and ATMs are early examples of human-robot partnership. Self-service, whether at Amazon.com, the gas station, the airport kiosk, self-checkout, or wherever customers often do the work of employees without thinking, has to have affected employment, but accounting for its subtle long-term effects is difficult, if not impossible. The effect of robots on employment will be difficult to measure, particularly because it cannot be calculated in the absence of robots' human pilots, mechanics, programmers, or other tenders. Raw numbers will be of limited value and will need to be compared to alternative estimates, especially at the level of GDP and national employment figures, where there can be no control population. But it's important to underline the key finding to date. Unlike farmers, who move to the cities as agriculture industrialized, we have few visible indicators of the effect of computers, much less robots, on work and employment. Do robots increase unemployment? Nobody really knows. Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee of MIT, in Race Against the Machine, suggest that the sheer speed and wide influence of digital innovation have prevented most people, skills and knowledge grow slowly, and organizations, business tasks and processes haven't changed fast enough either, from keeping up with the pace of change. Thus, the jobless recovery from the 2008 recession cannot be blamed on information technologies, but neither can they be said to have played no role. According to one school of thought, information technologies coincide with, and may be responsible for, a hollowing out of the U.S. workforce. Stagnant middle-class wage growth is well documented and likely has many contributing causes. One of these can be observed as computers take on more and more complex tasks, displacing people who formerly performed them within a job description. Widespread outsourcing of payroll, an essential function that delivers no competitive advantage, even when well done, to ADP and other firms, has caused the nearly complete demise of the payroll clerk, for example. David Autor, an economist at MIT, contends that when a job task is new, people are needed to perform it because humans can adapt, analyze, and improvise. As the task gets better understood and codified, machines can take over. The hole in the middle refers to vulnerable jobs that are neither low-wage and highly physical, nor high-wage and highly cognitive. Unfortunately, workers whose jobs are displaced struggle to find alternate employment in some new category. Experience shows that such workers are neither geographically portable, sometimes because of family ties or the effect of underwater mortgages, nor able to land jobs for which their skills might be useful, but their professional vocabulary, personal network, or earnings expectations are not. Downward mobility requires difficult adjustments. Will new robots displace more jobs than they create? The economic theory traditionally invoked in these situations suggests that labor-saving innovations free workers to perform work that adds more value. Farmers could stop tilling the soil by hand on small plots when first horses and later tractors made it possible for them to farm even larger fields. Today, roughly 2% of the U.S. population not only feeds the other 98%, but exports a significant quantity of crops and foods as well. Such a ratio would be inconceivable 100 years ago. MIT's Autor makes an important point. Just because a task can be automated does not mean it will. Within the same industry, and indeed the same company, automation depends on labor economics. Nissan Motor Company uses more robots at its factories in Japan than it does at those in India, where labor is considerably cheaper. As of 2013, Japan's unemployment rate was 4% versus 7.4% in the United States. Meanwhile, as of that same year, the International Federation of Robotics reported that Japan had 323 robots per 10,000 workers, whereas the United States deployed 152 per 10,000 workers in the general workforce, up from 72 only 10 years prior. Thus, at the macro level, Japan had more than twice as many robots proportional to the workforce, but roughly half the unemployment as compared to the United States. Judging from this example, at least, it would seem to be hard to prove that robots necessarily give rise to higher unemployment. But the Japanese economy does not resemble the U.S. economy in most respects. Ethnic diversity, population density, extractive industries, mining, farming, fishing, and energy, and ratios of imports to exports differ considerably between the two countries. Japan is aging more rapidly and admits far fewer immigrants. and attitudes towards robots in the two countries are conditioned by extremely different cultural milieus. Thus, it would be premature to cite Japan as definitive proof that robots do not contribute to higher unemployment. It is also easy to envision a scenario in which robots constitute a reserve army of labor, maintaining downward pressure on wages. Those Indian auto workers have a strong disincentive to strike, knowing that Nissan has robots in waiting for when wages get sufficiently high. Factories. How have robots been used in the U.S. workforce thus far? Given that the auto industry is the documented leader in the utilization of robot workers, looking at that sector can be suggestive for larger patterns, or the absence thereof. To date, robots behave very much like machine tools, doing repetitive tasks for which they are programmed, moving heavy items, spraying paint, or installing components on an assembly line. Robots are usually bolted down, heavy, special purpose, and caged for human safety. Several emerging trends suggest adoption of a new generation of robot workers. Rethink Robotics' Baxter robot came to market in 2012. Unlike traditional industrial robots, it is relatively cheap, about $25,000, safe around people, easily programmed, and multifunctional. Its target market is small businesses, where the robot can free workers to do more interesting and more valuable work, as opposed to picking items off an assembly line and putting them in bins or shipping boxes, for example. In addition to freeing people from repetitive, boring jobs, Baxter is designed to be installed within human workflows. Unlike assembly line robots, which are capable of inflicting potentially lethal force, it senses contact and can avoid harming humans. Supply chain. Another trend can be seen in supply chain robotic systems, the most visible example of which is made by Kiva, a Boston firm acquired by Amazon in 2012 and now called Amazon Robotics. Kiva is a perfect example of human-robot partnership. Humans' eyes and brains can detect patterns far better than robots, and their hands combine touch, adaptability, and nimbleness in ways that far exceed the capabilities of current robot graspers. Robots, on the other hand, are better at repetitive tasks, moving large items and following barcode stickers on the floor in a prearranged pattern. Thus, Kiva never touches an item, but instead moves racks of retail goods from filling to storage areas, and from storage to picking up and packing areas. Human workers don't need to walk the long distances characteristic of large distribution centers. The robots don't have to do hard tasks like visual discrimination or small item picking. Given how unpredictably Amazon behaves, it is significant that the company has not always deployed Kiva systems in the rapid expansion of its global distribution center network. One possible explanation for the apparent incongruity, other than that large corporate acquisitions take years to sort themselves out, is that Amazon was more interested in the software sophistication behind Kiva than the mechanical devices themselves. An article from 2007 made this point. Kiva warehouses are self-tuning, in that slower-selling items are moved into less accessible locations, whereas higher-velocity items are stocked on the edges of the storage area. Because the Kiva pods work 24 hours a day, moving slow-selling stock during periods of downtime, for example, can be driven by software rather than a human manager trying to juggle multiple priorities. The article's title, Random Access Warehouses, made precisely this point. The Big Picture. One reading of economic history suggests that when a task gets mechanized or automated, workers find new ways to be involved in the workforce. To take one notable example, as of 1970, 1/3 of women in the United States workforce were secretaries. With the introduction of the personal computer and word processing software, the need for secretaries fell off dramatically, but the overall number of women employed increased. In 1992, Robert Reich, who later became Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, predicted the emergence of a 3-tier labor market in developed economies. Reich started with personal service jobs, in healthcare and retail to take two huge examples, to which he added a second tier, production workers in a diminishing manufacturing sector, and foresaw the rise of a third, what he called symbolic analysts. This last tier includes financial services, engineering, software, and law. After a surge in its numbers, it's being automated. Big data tools are replacing humans, who are not as good as machines in scoring credit ratings or interpreting mammograms. As The Economist put it in May 2013, bank clerks and travel agents have already been consigned to the dustbin by the thousand. Teachers, researchers, and writers are next. Accounting and law are getting both offshored and automated. The task of legal discovery used to be labor-intensive and thus both expensive for the client and profitable for the partners who put associates and paralegals to work billing them mountains of hours. Now, much of the work can be done by software. Since Reich made his predictions, the degree of U.S. income inequality has increased. Gains by the top 20% of the population are largely driven by gains to the top 5%, or even 1%. A household of 2 public school teachers can make $140,000 between them, but that middle-income group is not the driving force here. Instead, a number of economists argue that large income gains, and thus large increases in income inequality, result from larger returns to capital rather than labor. The shift toward growth in investment-related income that leaves wage-related growth behind coincides closely with a growing gap between wages and productivity since about 1970. In other words, investments in capital, such as computers and other forms of automation, drove increases in productivity, whose benefits accrued largely to the owners of capital rather than to workers. Put those two trends together, automation of increasingly complex tasks and increasing returns to capital relative to wages, and the robot would appear to portend bad news for workers. 4 developments underlie this negative scenario. First, thanks to economies of scale, learning curves, and Moore's law of microprocessor performance, robots are becoming cheaper every year. Second, given advances in software engineering, machine vision, and other components, along with trickle-down innovation from the high levels of defense-related research and development, robots are also becoming more capable every year. Third, even though wage increases have been minimal, the continued growing rise in health insurance and other expenses incurred by human workers, including the cost of air conditioning, for example, mean that humans are becoming more expensive every year. And fourth, as Ela Norbach of Carnegie Mellon points out, robots don't need to replicate human performance, they just need to be good enough. Working alongside robots, human will learn how to make best use of robot strengths and how to best cover for their weaknesses, by providing non-machine vision when a robot gets stuck, for example, or by designing self-checkout lanes where customers do most of the work, with a single employee supervising 6 registers instead of operating 1. As we climb the learning curve, business processes will be redesigned around the humans' and robots' respective strengths. Given that low-wage laborers and the unemployed often lack both human and financial capital, it is most likely that robots will first be owned by capital rather than by labor. Higher up the wage scale, it's not as straightforward. Quantitative financial services investors can multiply and amplify their expertise by encoding it in computers, trading networks, and other robotic technologies. It's quite possible that radiologists could be early adopters of mammogram screening software, keeping control of the tools within the guild, as it were. Other forecasts are more sanguine. There has always been enough to do to keep most of the workforce busy. Robots will be used for the jobs people didn't want to do anyway. The 3 Ds of dull, dirty, and dangerous tasks are frequently cited. Experience bears this out. There have been successful tests or deployments of robots in bomb disposal, rescue efforts during a Fukushima-like disaster, repetitive assembly line tasks, even in vacuuming the living room. One school of thought foresees humans having much more leisure time in which to explore and express their interests and talents. Kevin Kelly, a founding editor at Wired, wrote in this vein, "We need to let robots take over. They will do jobs we have been doing and do them much better than we can. They will do jobs we can't do at all. They will do jobs we never imagined even needed to be done. And they will help us discover new jobs for ourselves, new tasks that expand who we are. They will let us focus on becoming more human than we were." Academic roboticists, when they express an opinion, often fall into this camp. Henrik Christensen of Georgia Tech is well regarded in his field, though no labor economist. He asserts, without evidence, that every manufacturing job brought back to the United States from offshore, a move made possible by robotics in many cases, also generates 1.3 other jobs in associated areas. The advantages of robots, lower costs, higher precision, and support for the requirements of clean rooms and similarly difficult environments for humans, make the number plausible. Even when products are made by robots, the manufacture of these products still needs to be supported by human processes, such as procurement, accounting, repair, and marketing. But the jobs question is not merely a matter of quantity. Frank Levy and Richard Murnane are labor economists who study the effect of information technologies on work. They suggest that to address the new division of labor between people and computers, there are 4 fundamental questions we need to answer. 1. What kinds of tasks do humans perform better than computers? 2. What kinds of tasks do computers perform better than humans? 3. In an increasingly computerized world, what well-paid work is left for people to do both now and in the future? 4. How can people learn the skills to do this work? Displacing an assembly line worker who puts handles on the car door does not free up a nurse to help address a shortage in that field, or a robot programmer, maintainer, or even cleaner. That is, the skills being replaced may well relate to jobs that did little to enhance human dignity in the first place, but at least they were jobs, and the path from displacement to redeployment is not at all well defined. Employers frequently invoke a skills gap and put pressure on schools and universities to update curricula. It's a valid concern, but Peter Capelli from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania also directs attention to employers that are reticent to train workers. There's also the question of how much employers' heavy reliance on deficient resume screening software may be driving artificially high unemployment. Thus, robotics' effect on employment has many second-order effects, and it's going to be difficult to get clear answers to what these might be anytime soon. Because there are few one-for-one equivalencies in any area of economics, particularly in the area of employment, we can defer the issue of robots' job displacement for 2 reasons. First, the confusion over what constitutes a robot makes matters difficult. Almost anything that relates to a tool or artifact of any sort might qualify. Second, it may be that job displacement by robots is farther along than most analyses would suggest. As of mid-2013, there were 11.76 million unemployed persons versus 143.9 million people who were employed. Simple math puts the mid-2013 unemployment rate at about 8%. Technical adjustments produced an official rate of 7.6%. What is not counted in these numbers are people who gave up looking, people who were working part-time when they wanted and needed to work full-time, and retirees, some of whom left work involuntarily. Another group of people, 14 million of them each month, who are not working collect disability payments. The rate of disability filings has nearly doubled since 1996. More than 1/3 of those claims related to back pain and musculoskeletal problems, and another 1/5 relate to mental illness and developmental disabilities. All conditions difficult to diagnose with any degree of confidence. Labor economist David Autor argues that disability is a kind of ugly secret of the American labor market. Part of the reason our unemployment rates have been low until recently is that a lot of people who would have trouble finding jobs are on a different program. The fact that the rate of disability filings doubled in a period that coincided with heavy technological unemployment, offshoring, call center automation, self-service retail, suggests that, as Brynjolfsson and McAfee have argued, new technologies are creating wealth and productivity, but not enough jobs for those displaced. Adding 7 million disability claims, half of the current total, into the ranks of the jobless would drive the official unemployment rate to a politically dangerous 12%. Again, not counting underemployment or premature retirements. Just to show how complicated the picture is, some of the people disabled, on paper anyway, by back and related issues, could be partnered with robots that could lift and move things. The scenario raises a thorny question. What will individuals with lifting limitations and often only a high school education bring to the human-robot partnership? Such questions will become more pressing sooner rather than later. In the interim, we are in the middle of a vast experiment involving millions of workers' lives and livelihoods.